Have you ever made a decision so small it felt like nothing at all, only to realize later it changed everything? One freezing night, a struggling single dad stumbled upon two shivering twin girls at the hospital gate. He had no idea that saving them would lead him straight into a secret, a mother he never expected, a miracle he never dared hope for, and a love story that would heal them all. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey of kindness, second chances, and the magic of family, if you believe in the power of small acts to change lives, don't forget to subscribe. Join us for more heartfelt stories that remind us all the world is still full of miracles waiting just beyond the gate. Now, let's begin. The wind howled like a wounded animal through the Wyoming hills, biting into Calder Briggs' face as he stepped out of the hospital maintenance exit. Snow was already gathering along the creases of his worn flannel coat, dusting his dark hair and beard. The temperature had dropped nearly 20 degrees in the past 2 hours. Somewhere behind him, the boiler room groaned with renewed life. He'd just spent the last 5 hours coaxing it back from the dead so the children's wing could stay warm through the night. He trudged across the icy lot toward his old Ford pickup, the one with the cracked windshield and a passenger door that jammed in the cold. His boots left impressions in the fresh snow, like punctuation marks in a silent novel. Most nights, this would be the moment he'd exhale, relieved to be done, eager to get home to Eli, his 10-year-old son. But tonight felt different. He heard it before he saw it, a soft, muffled whimper. It was the kind of sound you wouldn't notice unless your ears were trained by years of parenting and heartbreak. Calder stopped. He turned his head toward the hospital's side gate, the one no one used except for emergency deliveries. The gate stood half open, a faint glow of the security light casting long, broken shadows onto the snow-covered ground. And there they were, 2 little girls, no more than 5 or 6, huddled together under a thin blanket. No hats, no gloves, just shivering masses of limbs and frightened eyes. One had her arms wrapped protectively around the other. The smaller one was crying, quietly, like she'd learned a long time ago that crying loudly got her nowhere. Calder felt his chest clench. He didn't hesitate. He moved toward them, slow but steady, his boots crunching louder as he neared. "Hey there," he said gently, kneeling in front of them. "It's okay now. I've got you." The girls stared at him, terrified, but too cold to run. Calder shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around both of them, then scooped them up in his arms, one clinging to his neck, the other burying her face into his shoulder. They were so light, and so very cold. Inside the hospital, the overnight security guard barely looked up when Calder re-entered the lobby. "Found them by the side gate," Calder said. "They need help, now." The man shrugged. "They don't have ID. You can't just drop random kids here." Calder bit back, the sharp words pressing against his throat. He knew better than to argue with protocol, knew how slow the system could be, especially at midnight in a town like this. "Then I'll take them home," he said evenly. "Just give me some blankets and children's Tylenol." The guard blinked. "You sure?" "No one's freezing to death tonight," Calder said. The drive home was short, but tense. In the rearview mirror, Calder watched as the girls curled together on the bench seat of his truck, wrapped in fleece blankets from the ER's donation bin. He'd left a voicemail for his neighbor, Mrs. Delaney, asking her to check in on Eli, but the snow might have knocked out her power by now. When he opened the front door of their cabin, Eli was already awake, sitting on the couch with a flashlight and one of his mother's old books. "Dad?" Eli called, voice thin with worry. "I'm here, buddy," Calder answered, "and I brought company." Eli blinked at the sight of the 2 girls. "Who are they?" "I don't know yet," Calder admitted, "but they needed someone, just like we did once." The living room smelled faintly of old pine and ashes. Calder guided the girls to the fireplace and wrapped them in his old army blanket. The older one, Hazel, he would learn later, kept one hand protectively on her sister's arm. The younger girl, Willa, was still silent. Calder rummaged through the corner cabinet and pulled out the old record player, Emma's pride and joy. It hadn't worked in years, but something told him tonight was different. He placed the needle down on the worn vinyl of Moon River and gave the crank a slow turn. To his surprise, the player wheezed to life, and the soft melody filled the room. Hazel's shoulders lowered. Willa leaned into the warmth, and Eli, without being asked, sat beside them, offering them a tin cup of water like it was the most natural thing in the world. That night, they slept near the fire. 3 children who didn't know each other that morning, now bundled like siblings in the quiet peace of survival. Calder stayed awake, watching over them, his flannel shirt damp from melted snow, heart pounding with questions he couldn't yet answer. But one thing he knew with certainty: no one gets left outside the gate, not on his watch. The storm quieted by dawn, but the cold lingered like an unwanted memory. Calder stirred on the couch, shoulders stiff, one boot still on. His flannel shirt clung damply to his back, a souvenir from last night's rescue. The fire had dimmed to orange coals, but the room was warm, not from the embers, but from something else entirely. A stillness, a fragile kind of peace. He glanced toward the blanket nest by the hearth. Hazel lay curled protectively around Willa, both asleep, cheeks pink from warmth, not wind. Eli had joined them sometime after midnight, tucked under the army blanket, his head resting on a faded stuffed bear named Ranger. 3 children, tangled like tree roots, utterly different and already inseparable. Calder stood and stretched slowly, careful not to wake them. His cabin, though old, had a way of holding warmth once it settled in. The floors creaked, but gently, as if remembering how to accommodate little feet again. He moved to the kitchen, quietly setting a kettle on the stove, then reached up to the high shelf, past the mismatched mugs, the dented cereal bowls, and retrieved a wooden box. The box was heavy with time. Inside, pressed between old recipes and postcards from better days, lay a photograph. Emma, smiling in a yellow sundress, holding baby Eli in her arms. Calder ran a finger along the worn edge. Her smile still held the same force it always had, the kind that could knock the wind out of him. His eyes landed on the machine beside the box, the record player. Last night, it had worked like magic. Emma used to say it never spun unless the house was full of life. It knows when it's needed, she used to tease. He lifted the player's lid again and replaced the Moon River vinyl with an old Patsy Cline record. A soft scratch. Then the unmistakable sound of music from another era filled the room. Hazel stirred first, blinking sleep from her eyes. She didn't move, just stared at the ceiling beams with the kind of stillness only a child who'd seen too much could master. "Morning," Calder said softly, crouching beside her. She turned slowly toward him. "Did you make the music happen again?" Calder smiled. "Sort of. The old girl only works when she wants to. Why'd she want to last night?" He hesitated. "Because you were here." Maybe she missed laughter. Willa yawned, then pressed her face into her sister's side, still too shy to speak. Eli sat up groggily, blinking toward the kitchen. "You didn't come back to bed," he murmured. "I had a front row seat to a miracle," Calder said, nodding toward the girls. Eli looked at them, then to his father. "Are they staying?" "For now," Calder said, "until we figure things out." That morning, breakfast was nothing more than toast, eggs, and laughter. Calder made a pot of cocoa, stirring in the last of the cinnamon Emma had bought for Christmas 3 years ago. He'd saved it, thinking it might matter one day. It did. Hazel accepted her mug with a whisper of thanks. Willa smiled weakly and clutched it with both hands, as if it were treasure. Eli cleared a space on the coffee table and pulled out a deck of cards. "Want to play Go Fish?" Hazel nodded. Willa climbed into the chair beside her, still silent but visibly more at ease. Calder washed dishes at the sink, listening to the sounds behind him. Shuffling cards, soft laughter, Eli explaining the rules like a seasoned diplomat. His heart clenched with something he hadn't felt in years. Wholeness. Later that afternoon, after the girls had napped and Eli was reading in the loft, Calder carried in more firewood and noticed Hazel standing by the bookshelf. She wasn't reading, she was staring, eyes fixed on a specific row. "You like books?" he asked. She nodded. "We used to have some, but not ones like these." Calder followed her gaze. She was looking at Emma's books, dog-eared novels, poetry collections, and at the very end, the Velveteen Rabbit. "That one was my wife's favorite," he said, pulling it from the shelf. "She used to read it to Eli every night." Hazel took it in her small hands like it was holy. "Could you read it to us?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't read that book aloud since Emma died. For a long time, even looking at it felt like too much. But Hazel's eyes, wide and searching, left no room for hesitation. They sat by the fire that evening, Calder reading slowly, deliberately. "You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily." Hazel leaned into his side. Willa rested her head on his leg. Eli sat cross-legged in front of the hearth, listening with the quiet reverence of someone remembering something too tender to name. When Calder reached the final page, the room was hushed. The kind of hush you don't break with noise, but with breath. "That's the story my mom used to tell us," Hazel whispered. Calder swallowed hard. "Then maybe she and my Emma would have been friends." That night, after the children had gone to bed in a pile of blankets and dreams, Calder sat at the window and watched the snow fall. Soft, slow, without urgency. The record player still hummed in the background, and for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt alive. Alive. Because it remembered. Because it forgave. Because love, once shared, never really leaves. Not even in the coldest winters. Not even at the gate. The sun rose late that morning, veiled behind soft curtains of lingering snow clouds. The world outside was white and still, but inside the Briggs cabin, something fragile and sacred had begun to shift, like frost melting under a steady flame. Calder stirred a pot on the stove, steam fogging up the kitchen window. He worked in quiet concentration, brow furrowed, wooden spoon moving slowly through broth, thick with carrots and barley. The smell of chicken soup filled the room, not from a can, but from scratch, the way his mother used to make it every Sunday, no matter how tight things were. Hazel and Willa sat at the kitchen table, legs dangling above the floor. Hazel hummed softly, braiding Willa's hair with patient hands. Across from them, Eli doodled on the back of an old grocery list, pencil clenched tight in his fingers, tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth. The sight stirred something deep in Calder, an ache and a kind of quiet joy he hadn't felt in years. He reached high into the cupboard above the stove, behind the mismatched soup bowls and chipped coffee mugs, and pulled down a worn wooden box. Inside was a single piece of silver, a long, slightly tarnished spoon, engraved with the initials E.B. on the handle. Emma Briggs, his wife, his anchor, his laugh in the kitchen, his dance on the porch partner. She'd given him that spoon on their wedding day, tucked into a folded napkin at their backyard reception. "We won't always have much," she'd whispered, "but we'll have soup, and we'll share it with people who need it." Calder had never used the spoon since she died. It had become a relic, more shrine than utensil. But this morning, it didn't feel like a monument. It felt like an invitation. He brought it to the table, set it down gently beside Hazel's bowl. "This was my wife's," he said softly. "She believed in sharing what you had, even if all you had was soup." Hazel looked up at him. "Is it okay if I use it?" "I think she'd like that," Calder said. Willa reached across the table and slipped her hand into his. The meal was simple: soup, buttered bread, and laughter. Eli told the girls about the time he accidentally glued his shoes to the floor during a science project. Hazel talked about a cat they'd once seen that had only one ear, but still caught birds. Willa, still mostly silent, drew pictures with her finger in the condensation on her glass. Calder watched it all unfold, with the wary awe of a man who'd forgotten that life could be like this. Uncomplicated, unguarded, shared. After breakfast, they bundled up to shovel the walkway. The snow had hardened overnight, thick as icing over a cake. Calder handed Eli the smaller shovel and guided Hazel in how to scoop and toss, her little arms straining but determined. Willa, too small to help, wandered to the edge of the property where a wooden fence met the tree line. She stood there a long moment, watching a cardinal hop from branch to branch. Calder walked over slowly, boots crunching. "You like birds?" he asked. She nodded. "That one's a good sign," he said. "Red bird in the snow. Means something beautiful's about to happen." Willa looked up at him. For the first time, she spoke. "You're nice," she whispered. It knocked the wind out of him more than any blizzard could. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Delaney came by with a tray of cinnamon rolls, eyes wide at the sight of 3 children sitting on the floor, building a blanket fort between 2 chairs. "Well, I'll be," she said, smiling. "Looks like you've got yourself a crew, Calder Briggs." "They sort of adopted me," Calder replied with a crooked grin. Delaney leaned in closer. "You look better. You've been so quiet since Emma passed." Calder paused. "I think maybe I just needed to hear laughter again." She nodded, touching his arm. "Laughter finds us when we're ready." That evening, the wind kicked up again, brushing against the windows like old memories trying to come home. Calder lit a fire and brought out the tin of marshmallows he'd saved from Eli's last birthday. "Tonight," he announced, "we roast and we read." The children settled around the hearth, sticky fingers and sleepy eyes. Calder pulled the Velveteen Rabbit off the shelf again and opened it to the middle. "Real isn't how you were made," he read aloud, voice slow and warm. "It's a thing that happens to you." Hazel closed her eyes. Willa leaned her head on Eli's shoulder. Calder looked down at the silver spoon resting on the end table beside him. Forgotten for now, but no longer lonely. A symbol not of sorrow, but of continuation, of legacy, of soup and snow and small acts of kindness that ripple outward like warmth in winter. Outside, the world was still frozen. But inside, in a little cabin where grief once lived alone, something was beginning to thaw. Love didn't always return the way it left. Sometimes it crept in quietly, wearing the voices of children, the scent of cinnamon, the weight of a spoon handed across a table. Morning drifted into the cabin like a familiar guest, soft, golden, and unhurried. Calder woke to the sound of muffled giggles. He sat up slowly on the couch, stiff from another night sleeping there, and squinted toward the living room. A pile of blankets near the hearth shifted, revealing tousled heads and bright eyes. Hazel and Willa were building something, a fortress of pillows and chairs, blankets draped between them like a makeshift castle. Eli, their newly minted co-conspirator, supervised with the grave seriousness of a field marshal. Calder smiled into the sleeve of his worn flannel shirt, heart aching in the best way. The cabin, once echoing with silence, now pulsed with life again. He rose, moving quietly toward the bookshelf. His fingers brushed against the worn spine of the Velveteen Rabbit. Yesterday, Hazel had asked him to read it. Today, it felt less like a request and more like a promise. He cleared his throat, and the children froze mid-pillow stacking, spinning to face him. "Story time?" Hazel asked, her voice already tinged with hope. "Story time," Calder confirmed, settling into the old rocking chair beside the fire. 3 small figures scrambled into a tangle at his feet, eyes wide with expectation. Willa tucked herself into Hazel's side. Eli leaned forward on his elbows, chin propped in his hands. Calder opened the book. The pages crackled slightly, the paper yellowed and soft from decades of reading and rereading. Emma's handwriting still marked the inside cover. "For when you need to remember what love does," he began, voice low and even. "There was once a velveteen rabbit, and in the beginning, he was really splendid." As he read, the world outside the windows faded. The snow, the loneliness, the yawning ache of years past. There was only the story now. A rabbit who longed to be real, and the slow, patient work of love making it so. The children listened, as if the story were a secret, meant only for them. When Calder reached the passage Emma had always lingered on, he slowed instinctively. Real isn't how you are made. It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real. Hazel let out a soft sigh, barely audible. Willa pressed her small hand against Calder's knee. Eli leaned his head against the hearthstones, closing his eyes. In that small room, something shifted. The words were more than words. They were a kind of magic. They wove between the broken places, filling the cracks with gold. After the story, Calder set the book down carefully and looked at them, one by one. "You know," he said, voice rough with emotion, "I think you 3 might be making me real." Hazel giggled, a bright, free sound that filled the cabin's rafters. Willa smiled, a full, brilliant smile that made Calder's chest ache. Even Eli, shy and slow to trust, grinned without hesitation. "You were already real," Eli said simply. "You just forgot." Calder chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "Maybe I did." The rest of the day unfolded in the easy, golden way that good days sometimes do. Calder showed the girls how to stack firewood properly without smashing their fingers. Eli taught them how to beat him at Go Fish, which they did with ruthless efficiency. They made peanut butter sandwiches, ate them cross-legged on the living room floor, and built snow forts that leaned dangerously but held. When Willa accidentally dropped her sandwich face down in the snow, Calder only laughed and made another. There was no rush, no deadlines, only the slow knitting together of a life. That evening, Calder tucked the children into a pile of blankets near the fireplace again. Hazel tugged at his sleeve just as he was about to stand up. "Will you tell us a real story?" she asked. Calder hesitated. "What kind of real story?" "One about you." "Before?" He sat back down slowly. The firelight played over the familiar lines of the cabin walls, casting long shadows that seemed to listen along with them. "Well," he began, "a long time ago, before you were even born. There was a boy who lived in a house like this one, and he thought he needed to be tough all the time. Strong, so nobody would know he was scared. But then he met a girl who laughed like sunshine, and he learned that real strength isn't about being tough. It's about loving something enough to protect it." Hazel's eyes glistened. "What happened to her?" Willa whispered. Calder swallowed hard. "She had to go away, but she left a little bit of her love behind." "In you?" Eli asked. "In all of us," Calder said, "if we let it stay." The children were quiet for a long time after that, the fire crackling in the silence. Outside, the snow fell again, soft and steady, blanketing the world in second chances. That night, after the cabin had gone still, Calder sat by the window once more. He thought about how love made things real, about how grief, too, was proof that something had once been beautifully alive. About how perhaps, just perhaps, some kinds of love never ended at all. They simply waited. Waited for a worn flannel coat, a broken record player, a silver spoon, or a pair of shivering girls at a forgotten gate. Snow still blanketed the world in a soft hush, but life inside the Briggs cabin had taken on a quiet momentum. Days blurred into a rhythm of small, precious moments. Bowls of stew steaming in mittened hands, card games by the fire, the crackle of the old record player spinning songs that seemed to remember better days. Hazel, Willa, and Eli built towers of books and castles of snow, their laughter weaving through the house like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. Yet beneath the warmth, a question pulsed, steady and unrelenting. Where had Hazel and Willa come from, and who was out there missing them? Calder stared at the girls now, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor. Hazel was helping Willa sound out words from an old children's premiere, her patience remarkable. Willa stumbled over the letters, frowning, and Hazel corrected her softly, never once making her feel small. They belonged to someone. Somewhere. He owed it to them, and to himself, to find out. That afternoon, while the kids napped, Calder stepped outside to the porch and pulled his phone from his coat pocket. Reception was spotty out here, but he managed a call to the local sheriff's department. The same dispatcher who always answered, a woman named Patty who knew everyone's business before they did, picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Calder, that old boiler acting up again?" "Not today," he said. "I'm calling about some kids." A pause, then wary curiosity. "What kind of kids?" "Two girls, about 5, 6 years old. Found them outside the hospital gate a few nights back." He gave a brief, careful description. Their size, their coloring, the fact they spoke little but seemed unharmed otherwise. "Doesn't match any missing persons reports we've got locally," Patty said after a beat. "You want me to widen the search?" "Yeah," Calder said, looking back at the closed cabin door. "But do it quiet-like, would you?" Patty chuckled. "You got a soft spot, Briggs." "Always have," he said. "Just forgot for a while." He hung up, a pit forming in his stomach. Sooner or later, someone would come looking. Or maybe no one would. Maybe Hazel and Willa had been invisible for a long, long time before they ever showed up at that gate. Either way, Calder knew one thing. He wouldn't let them feel forgotten again. Meanwhile, miles away, another call was being made. At the city hospital downtown, Dr. Everly Hart ended her shift and checked her voicemail. She was weary down to her bones. Long days treating respiratory illnesses in a brutal winter had left everyone on edge. But one message caught her attention. Patty's voice, filtered through static. "Hey Doc, Longshot here. You ever hear about 2 little girls missing a few years back after that accident up by the state line? Got a situation that feels unfinished." Everly froze. She hadn't allowed herself to hope for a long time. 3 years ago, after a winter medical convoy accident in the mountains, her twin daughters had vanished during the chaos. Search teams had scoured the area for weeks before they were declared, presumed dead. Friends and colleagues had urged her to move on, to heal. She had buried them in her mind, because that was the only way to survive. But some wounds never fully closed. Her hands shook slightly as she redialed the number. Patty picked up. "Sheriff's office?" "This is Dr. Hart," Everly said, voice tight. "Tell me about the girls." Back at the cabin, Calder decided it was time to have a different kind of conversation. When the kids were awake and curled up again by the hearth, he knelt in front of them, resting his arms on his knees. "I need to ask you both something," he said gently. Hazel's face tightened instinctively, like she was ready for bad news. Willa leaned into her sister's side. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to," Calder assured them. "But, do you remember your last name?" Hazel bit her lip, thinking hard. After a long moment, she whispered, "Heart." Calder blinked. "Heart?" She nodded. Mommy said, "We're her hearts." His stomach twisted. "Heart. Heart." It was close. Close enough that it could have been misheard by small ears. He smiled softly. "That's a good name," he said, ruffling her hair. "A name worth finding." He tucked the information away like a fragile ember. Tomorrow, he'd press harder with the sheriff's office. Tonight, he'd let them be kids again. That night, as Calder added another log to the fire, Eli climbed onto the couch beside him. "Dad," he said, tracing patterns into the couch fabric with his finger. "If someone comes for them, will they have to go?" Calder felt his heart pull in two directions at once. "They might," he said honestly, "if it's their family and it's safe." Eli was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice almost too small to hear, "I hope if someone came for me, and you weren't here, they'd be good like you." Calder closed his eyes against the sudden sting behind them. He reached out and pulled Eli into a fierce hug. "I'd always come for you," Calder said into his son's hair. "Always." Eli's arms tightened around his waist, silent but sure, and somewhere in the warmth of that old cabin, among the forgotten books and flickering firelight, the walls that grief had built began to crumble a little more. Outside, the snow kept falling. But inside, love had started to leave echoes of names, of promises, of a future not yet written. And this time, Calder Briggs intended to answer. The next morning dawned gray and brittle, the kind of cold that sank deep into the bones of the mountains and made every breath feel heavier. Inside the Briggs cabin, however, the world felt lighter. Hazel and Willa were helping Eli build a cardboard city in the living room, complete with crooked skyscrapers and a fleet of paper airplanes. Calder stood in the kitchen, sipping weak coffee from a chipped mug, a faint smile playing at his mouth as he watched them. Eli was talking more these days, laughing even. Hazel's quiet steadiness and Willa's tentative joy had drawn him out like sunlight, coaxing life from frozen ground. Calder could see it plain as day. Eli was healing in ways that no medicine or careful plans ever could. But healing, he knew, could be a fragile thing. By mid-morning, the sky lightened enough for Calder to declare a break from indoor activities. "Let's go outside and build a snowman," he said, clapping his hands once. 3 cheers erupted from the children, and soon they were bundled in oversized coats and mittens, tramping through knee-high snow in the yard. Calder helped roll the snowballs into lopsided tiers, while Eli, Hazel, and Willa scavenged for sticks, stones, and an old carrot from the kitchen bin. Laughter rang out, real and high and beautiful. It was during one of these joyous sprints across the yard that Calder noticed something. Eli slowing down, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his cheeks paler than the winter sky. "Buddy," Calder called out, heart tightening. Eli waved him off, smiling weakly, but his steps faltered. He dropped the stick he was carrying, hands clutching at his chest. And then, without a sound, he crumpled into the snow. Calder's heart stopped. He was moving before he realized it, snow spraying in his wake. He fell to his knees beside his son, scooping him up, brushing the snow from his face. "Eli, Eli, buddy, stay with me." His voice cracked as he cradled the boy close. Hazel and Willa stood frozen nearby, wide-eyed and silent. Calder forced himself to focus. Eli's pulse fluttered against his fingertips, weak, but there. His breathing was shallow, hitching in and out like a broken machine. He had to move. Now, the hospital wasn't far, but in weather like this, it would feel like crossing an ocean. Calder didn't waste a second. He wrapped Eli tighter in his coat and barked to Hazel and Willa. "Into the truck, now!" The girls scrambled to obey, their faces pale with terror. Calder drove like a man possessed, the truck fishtailing slightly on the unplowed road, engine groaning in protest. Eli lay limp on the seat beside him, every shallow breath echoing like gunshots in Calder's ears. "Hang on, buddy," he whispered over and over, a prayer stitched to every heartbeat. He didn't know he was crying until the salt burned the corners of his mouth. The hospital's emergency bay loomed ahead, blurred by a sheet of falling snow. Calder skidded into the parking lot, yanked the truck into park, and leapt out, cradling Eli against his chest. "Help!" he roared the moment he burst through the sliding doors. Nurses sprang into motion. A gurney appeared. Hands reached for Eli. Calder had to force himself to let go, to trust strangers with the most precious thing he had left. And then, amidst the flurry of scrubs and equipment, a figure stepped forward, a woman in a white coat. Tall, composed, with eyes so sharp they seemed to see straight through the chaos. Her badge read, Dr. Everly Hart. "Tell me what happened," she commanded. Calder tried, words tangling in his throat. Something about a heart defect, about the cold, about Eli just collapsing without warning. Dr. Hart listened, then turned to the nurses with crisp, rapid orders. "Epi ready. Oxygen. Prep for cardiac evaluation now." Calder stood there, helpless, as they wheeled Eli through swinging doors and out of sight. Hazel clung to his hand. Willa huddled close against his leg. He sank into the nearest chair. Numb. Minutes, or maybe hours later, Dr. Hart returned. Her expression was serious but not hopeless. "He's stable," she said. "We caught it in time. The cold stressed his heart more than usual, but he's strong. He's fighting." Calder sagged with relief, every muscle in his body trembling. "Can I see him?" he rasped. "In a little while," she promised gently. "Let us monitor him first." She hesitated, then crouched, so she was eye level with Hazel and Willa. "And who do we have here?" she asked softly. The girls pressed closer to Calder. "They're with me," Calder said. "Long story." Something flickered across Dr. Hart's face. Recognition, disbelief, a tremor of hope. Are they your daughters?" she asked, voice strangled by emotion she couldn't hide. Calder frowned. "No, I found them. Outside the hospital gate, a few nights ago." Dr. Hart's hand flew to her mouth. Hazel peeked up shyly. "You look like Mommy," she whispered. The woman's breath hitched audibly. For a moment, the world spun too fast to catch. Later, Calder would sit beside Eli's hospital bed, watching the steady beep of the monitors, feeling gratitude so raw it hurt. And across the hall, Dr. Everly Hart would sit in stunned silence, two precious girls curled against her, as the pieces of a broken life began, against all odds, to knit themselves back together. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in second chances and the fragile beginnings of miracles. Dr. Everly Hart sat in the dimly lit consultation room, elbows resting on her knees, head bowed into trembling hands. Hazel and Willa had fallen asleep on the narrow couch beside her, their heads nestled together, breathing deep and even. A knitted hospital blanket lay draped over them, and even in sleep, Willa's small hand clutched Hazel's shirt tightly, as if afraid the world might shift again and steal her away. Everly watched them, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, trying to make sense of the impossible truth, sitting only inches away. Her daughters. Alive. 3 years ago, she had stood over 2 tiny white caskets, empty but heavy with the weight of presumed loss, after the chaos of the accident. The van carrying her children, along with other patients, had careened off a snowy back road, crashing down a ravine. Rescue teams found wreckage, broken equipment, blood, but no bodies. Eventually, they found evidence that suggested the girls had been swept away by winter's merciless hand, lost in a way only mountains could swallow. Everly had buried hope that day. Buried it so deep, she believed it could never find its way back. Until now, a soft knock at the door pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. Calder stood there, awkward but determined, a styrofoam cup of coffee in one hand, the other shoved deep into his jacket pocket. "Thought you might need this," he said. Everly accepted the coffee with numb fingers. He hesitated, glancing at the sleeping girls. "You want to tell me how this happened?" She sat back, the chair creaking under her. "I don't know everything," she said quietly. "Only pieces." Calder pulled up another chair, careful not to wake the girls. He said nothing, giving her the space to find her words. "I was supposed to be on that convoy," Everly began, voice rough. "It was a medical mission, taking supplies and some of the patients' families to a new clinic site in the mountains. I stayed behind for a last-minute surgery." Her mouth twisted. "When the accident happened, they called me to the scene. I found the wreckage, the driver's body, blood trails. I searched, we all searched, for days, weeks." Calder nodded slowly, face drawn with understanding. "But there were no bodies, no footprints after the blizzard came through. Only signs they might have survived for a while. Maybe wandered. Maybe." Her voice broke, and she pressed her knuckles against her mouth until she could steady herself. "I was told to let them go, to mourn. Everyone said it was mercy. Closure." She laughed bitterly, a sound like broken glass. "I buried my daughters in my heart so I could survive." Calder leaned forward, elbows on knees, studying her with those same patient eyes that had met Hazel and Willa, with nothing but unconditional kindness. "You think they wandered to town?" he asked. Everly shrugged helplessly. "Maybe someone found them. Maybe someone didn't know what to do. Maybe they were passed around, lost again and again, until they ended up back here." Calder's fists clenched unconsciously on his thighs. "And nobody came forward?" he asked. "No," Everly said. "Not until now." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle hum of the hospital heater. Finally, Calder asked, "What happens next?" Everly looked at him, and in that moment, she wasn't a doctor or a professional or a survivor. She was just a mother, clinging to the chance she thought she'd lost forever. "I don't know," she whispered. Down the hall, Eli stirred in his hospital bed, a low groan escaping his lips. Calder was on his feet in an instant, murmuring something about checking on his boy. Everly watched him go, her heart aching. This man, this stranger, had taken her daughters in without question. He had fed them, kept them warm, taught them to laugh again. He had risked everything to save a sick child who wasn't even his own by blood. And he had done it all quietly, without asking for anything in return. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the echo of something she hadn't dared to believe in for a long time. Maybe goodness really did still exist in this world. Maybe it wore battered boots and carried kids through snowstorms without thinking twice. When Calder returned, his face was tired, but relieved. "Eli's stable," he reported. "Sleeping." He hesitated, then added, "Your girls. They're gonna want answers. They're gonna have questions you can't run from." "I know," Everly said softly. "And you've got to decide whether you're ready to be their mom again." She flinched, the words hitting like a clean strike to the ribs. Not cruel, but impossibly true. "I want to be," she said. Calder studied her for a long beat. "Then start by telling them a story," he said, his voice low and sure. "Not about hospitals or accidents, or being lost. Tell them who you were, who they were, who you all could be again." Everly nodded slowly, tears burning hot at the corners of her eyes. She looked over at the girls who shifted in their sleep, their faces soft, innocent despite everything. Real, she thought. They're real. And I still have time to be real for them. Outside the hospital window, the storm was beginning to break. Faint shafts of sunlight pierced the clouds, falling across the snow, like hope stitching itself back into the fabric of a broken world. It wasn't too late. It was never too late. The hospital corridor smelled faintly of antiseptic and old coffee, but to Calder, it smelled like hope. He stood just outside Eli's room, watching through the narrow window as his son slept, chest rising and falling beneath the tangle of thin blankets. The monitor beeped steady and calm, a sound more beautiful than any song Calder had ever heard. Hazel and Willa sat on a bench nearby, clutching cups of lukewarm cocoa the nurses had given them. Their small bodies leaned instinctively toward each other, still wary, still learning that safety could be real. And across from them, with her coat folded neatly on her lap, sat Dr. Everly Hart. She wasn't just a doctor tonight. She was a mother relearning how to breathe. When Calder returned to the waiting area with 2 sandwiches from the vending machine, Everly stood and approached him. "Can we talk?" she asked, voice softer now, less shielded. Calder handed Hazel and Willa their food before nodding, following Everly to a quiet alcove off the main hall. The hospital buzzed around them, nurses paging, doors swinging, phones ringing. But in that little space, it was just the 2 of them. Everly didn't waste time. "I can get Eli transferred," she said, "to a better facility. Specialists, state-of-the-art treatment." Calder frowned, wary. "At what cost?" "No cost," she said quickly. "I'll cover it. Private donation." He studied her carefully. "Why?" Everly met his gaze without flinching. "Because you saved my daughters." Silence bloomed between them, heavy and aching. "You didn't have to take them in," she continued. "You didn't know them. You risked everything without expecting anything back." Calder shook his head. "You don't owe me." "I do," Everly said, her voice catching. "I owe you. And I owe them. I was the one who failed them first." Her words cracked at the edges, and for a moment, Calder saw past the crisp white coat, past the professional veneer, to the woman who had loved and lost, and somehow still found the strength to show up. "You didn't fail them," he said gruffly. "You got hurt. Same as the rest of us." Everly blinked hard, swallowing emotion. "So let me help now," she whispered. "Let me do this right." The formalities came together faster than Calder expected. Everly called in favors, whispered to administrators, pulled strings that most people didn't even know existed. Within hours, a plan was in place. Eli would be moved the next morning to a pediatric cardiac center 2 towns over, a place where cutting-edge procedures gave kids like him real chances at real futures. No promises, but possibilities. Calder sat at Eli's bedside, holding his hand, staring at his son's pale face, and wondered how he'd gotten here, how a broken man with nothing but an old truck and a patched-up coat had stumbled into the middle of so many miracles. Later that night, Everly sat with Hazel and Willa in the family lounge. The girls were quiet at first, as they always were when the air grew heavy with memories. But when Everly started talking, not as a doctor, but as their mother, the room softened. She told them about birthdays in the old house, about chocolate cupcakes that always tilted sideways in the oven, about bedtime stories read under a tent of blankets, about a song she used to hum to them when the world felt too big. Hazel listened with wide eyes, her hand inching closer to Everly's with every word. Willa sat silently, clutching a small knitted rabbit one of the nurses had given her. But when Everly paused, she spoke. "You smell like Mommy," Willa said. Everly's heart shattered and reformed all in the same breath. She reached out slowly, offering her arms without expectation. And then, carefully, tentatively, Hazel and Willa leaned in, folding themselves into the embrace they had once known by heart. Tears burned Everly's eyes, but she let them fall freely. Some things didn't need to be rebuilt. They just needed to be found again. Near midnight, Calder and Everly met once more in the quiet hall outside Eli's room. He rubbed the back of his neck, weary but grateful. "You didn't have to do all this." "I wanted to," Everly said. "I still do." They stood there awkwardly, two battle-worn souls who had spent too long thinking they had to carry everything alone. "Thank you," Calder said finally. The words simple, but heavy with all the things he couldn't say. Everly smiled, a small, genuine thing that made her seem years younger. "You gave me my family back," she said. "I just want to return the favor." They didn't hug. They didn't cry. They just stood together, shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same air, carrying the same invisible, sacred weight. It was enough. Later, when Calder returned to Eli's bedside, he found Hazel and Willa asleep in the armchair, curled up like kittens. He eased into the chair opposite them, stretched out his legs, and let his eyes drift shut. He dreamed of a porch swing creaking in summer, of laughter bouncing off worn wood floors, of a record player humming in the corner. He dreamed of a life rebuilt not from money or success, but from kindness, patience, and the smallest, most stubborn acts of love. Outside, the snow was finally easing, the clouds parting to reveal the faint glitter of stars overhead. Miracles didn't always come the way you expected. Sometimes they arrived wearing worn boots and old coats. Sometimes they arrived crying on the steps of a forgotten hospital gate. And sometimes they came as a trade. A life for a life. A heart for a heart. 2 weeks later, the world had changed. The hospital stay had been long and uncertain, but Eli was finally stronger. The new procedure, funded quietly and completely by Everly's private donation, had given his heart the boost it needed to start fighting again. He was pale, thinner than before, but alive in a way that shimmered beneath his skin like sunlight trapped in winter ice. And Calder? He barely recognized the man he saw in the mirror anymore. Gone was the hollow-eyed father scraping by on hope and stubbornness alone. In his place stood someone steadier, someone reborn, not through triumph, but through tenderness. His own, and that of the small hands that had so unexpectedly clung to his. It was late afternoon when they returned to the cabin. The snow had begun to thaw into muddy banks along the road, but in the yard, white still stretched in uneven patches under the shade of the big silo tree, the ancient oak that towered near the old grain silo at the back of the property. Emma used to call it their wishing tree. Calder parked the truck carefully and helped Eli out, the boy's steps wobbly but determined. Hazel and Willa tumbled from the back seat, racing up the porch steps with shrieks of laughter. Everly followed, slower, carrying a duffel bag filled with medicines, instructions, and too many leaflets Calder would never read. As they crossed the yard, Calder noticed something odd. The old porch swing was swaying, though there was no wind. When he looked closer, he saw it. Someone, probably Eli, had tied a frayed length of rope from the swing to the branch of the silo tree, where a battered metal bucket hung. It was a makeshift bell, a call to gather. Calder smiled despite himself. Inside, the cabin still smelled faintly of old wood and ashes, but now it smelled also of cinnamon, cocoa, and something rarer. Hope steeped deep into the walls. Hazel made a beeline for the bookshelf. Willa went straight for the fireplace, and Eli, with the careful reverence of a boy carrying sacred treasure, pulled out the old record player. "Think it'll work again?" he asked, looking up at Calder. Calder knelt beside him, checking the battered machine. "I think," Calder said slowly, "if it remembers us, it just might." They placed the worn Moon River vinyl on the spindle. Eli cranked the handle gently. A scratch, a stutter, and then Music. Soft, warbling, imperfect music, filling every corner of the cabin like breath after long suffocation. Hazel clapped her hands. Willa twirled awkwardly in her socks. Everly leaned against the doorway, one hand covering her heart. Calder stood up and crossed the room. Without thinking, he held out his hand. Everly hesitated only a moment before slipping her fingers into his. Together, they swayed, not dancing exactly, but simply moving to the rhythm of something larger than themselves. Something old, stitched from memory and forgiveness, and a future too fragile yet to name. The children laughed and spun around them like fireflies. Outside the window, the silo tree swayed under the weight of promises whispered into its bark years ago. Later, after cocoa and marshmallows and far too many rounds of Go Fish, Calder and Everly sat together on the porch steps, watching the twilight settle across the fields. The sky was streaked with pale lavender and soft gold. The first star winked awake above the silhouette of the silo. For a long time, neither of them spoke. It was enough to sit there, shoulder to shoulder, breathing in the cooling air, listening to the old swing creak in the breeze. Finally, Everly broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "how many miracles we miss because we're too busy looking for the big ones?" Calder thought about that, about the girls huddled by the hospital gate, about the spoon passed from hand to hand, about the old record player that refused to die, about the boy with a broken heart who now slept safely in the next room. "No," Calder said after a long pause. "I think miracles are smart. I think they find people who need them, whether we're paying attention or not." Everly smiled, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. "I guess they found us," she said. "Yeah," Calder murmured, voice thick. "They found us." Later still, after the children were asleep, Calder sat by the window, the cabin quiet, but never lonely. The record player had wound down to silence. But the memory of music, the warmth it had carried, lingered in the floorboards, the rafters, the spaces between breathing. Calder closed his eyes and listened, to the echo of laughter, to the creak of the swing, to the heartbeat of a home rebuilt not with money or perfection, but with second chances, stitched together by hands that refused to let go. Outside, under the silo tree, the rope bucket swung gently in the night breeze, a quiet, steady reminder. Sometimes you don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes the softest call is the one that saves you. Spring crept into the valley in shy, halting steps. The snow receded in muddy rivulets down the hillsides. Crocuses pushed tentative heads through thawing soil, and the silo tree at the back of Calder's property began to bud with the first whisper of green. Inside the cabin, life had fallen into a rhythm so natural that it felt as though it had always been this way. Hazel and Willa now had their own coats, hanging on the wall peg, boots lined up next to Eli's by the door. A chore chart, handwritten in Calder's uneven scrawl, hung proudly on the fridge. Evenings were spent by the fire, telling stories, playing board games worn soft by years of love. And Everly, no longer just Dr. Hart, no longer the distant figure of a forgotten past, had become part of them too. A steady, healing presence, a mother rediscovering the way home. One Saturday morning, Calder stood at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up, whistling softly as he scrubbed stubborn oatmeal out of an old pot. Through the window, he watched the children racing around the yard, laughter pealing through the fresh air like bells. Eli, his energy restored, was trying to hoist Hazel onto a tire swing that Calder had finally fixed. Willa clapped and cheered from the sidelines, her pigtails bouncing with each jump. Everly appeared at his side, a coffee mug in hand, still in her jeans and faded flannel shirt, the kind of clothes that had once belonged to a life she thought she'd never reclaim. "They're growing roots here," she said quietly, following his gaze. Calder nodded, drying his hands on a dish towel. "Hard to believe it's only been a few months." Feels like longer, Everly said. Feels like forever. She said it without fear, without apology. Calder leaned against the counter, crossing his arms loosely. You think they're ready? He asked. For what? For whatever comes next. Everly turned to face him fully. There was a light in her eyes now, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. I think they're waiting for us, she said, to decide. That afternoon, Calder drove them into town. The whole ragtag crew crammed into the old Ford pickup, with Hazel and Willa singing off-key in the back seat, and Eli rolling his eyes in exaggerated suffering. They parked by the town square, where an old bandstand stood surrounded by pop-up tents and community booths. A spring into summer fair had sprung up almost overnight. Local artisans selling quilts and jams, children chasing balloons, an old man strumming folk songs on a battered guitar. It was simple. It was ordinary. It was perfect. They wandered from booth to booth, sampling sweet cider and homemade fudge. Willa clutched a hand-knit rabbit gifted to her by an elderly woman who insisted, every girl deserves a little magic. Hazel found a set of watercolor postcards and talked Calder into buying them for writing to people we love. Eli got his face painted, a crooked superhero mask he wore with a fierce kind of pride. And Everly? Everly watched it all unfold with a smile so wide it broke something loose in Calder's chest. Near the end of the afternoon, Calder spotted a small booth set up by the local fire department, selling raffle tickets to raise funds for a new playground. Win a picnic for two under the silo tree, the sign boasted, plus a surprise. Calder laughed softly. That tree's famous now. You should enter, Everly teased. He shook his head. Never won a thing in my life. But Hazel and Willa overheard. They raced over, pooled their allowance money, and shoved a ticket into Calder's hand. You have to, Hazel insisted. It's for the tree, Willa added solemnly. Calder pretended to grumble, but filled out the stub. He forgot about it almost immediately. It wasn't until they were packing up to leave, marshmallow sticky and sun-drunk, that a voice called over the loudspeaker. And the winner of the silo tree picnic is Calder Briggs, the kids shrieked. Everly laughed, a real, full laugh that lit up the square. Blushing furiously, Calder stepped up to accept the certificate, muttering thanks, already planning to turn it into an adventure for the children. But when he turned around, Hazel was tugging at his sleeve. Not for us, she said, grinning mischievously. It's for you and Miss Everly. Calder blinked. Eli chimed in, loud enough for half the town to hear. Yeah, Dad, ask her. A chorus of laughter rippled around them. Everly's cheeks flushed pink, but she stepped closer, tilting her head up to meet Calder's startled gaze. Well, she said, amusement dancing in her eyes. You gonna waste your big prize? Calder stared at her, at the children, his son, her daughters, and at the life they were already stitching together out of old wood and stubborn hope. And then, without thinking, without planning, he spoke. How about this? He said, voice low but sure. Come have that picnic with me. Come build a life here with me. Stay. The words weren't flashy. They weren't polished. They were Calder Briggs, solid, honest, a little rough around the edges, but absolutely true. Everly's smile softened, and her hand slipped into his without hesitation. I thought you'd never ask, she said. Around them, the children whooped and hollered, jumping up and down as if the 4th of July had come early. Hazel grabbed Willa's hands and spun her in a wild circle. Eli threw his arms in the air and shouted, Finally! And Calder, standing there with Everly's hand in his, realized something that had been true all along. This wasn't the proposal he had planned. It was the proposal he had needed. Unexpected. Unscripted. Absolutely perfect. As they piled back into the truck, a new warmth settled over Calder, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. Sometimes families weren't born. Sometimes they were found, built one battered miracle at a time, out of second chances and stubborn love. And sometimes, if you were lucky enough to say yes when life offered it, you found yourself standing beneath a silo tree, holding the whole world in your hands. Spring stretched its arms across the valley in earnest now, scattering wildflowers across the meadows and painting the fields in shades of new life. The last of the stubborn snow melted from the woods, uncovering forgotten trails, old footpaths, and the quiet remnants of seasons that had passed without witness. At the Briggs cabin, everything was changing, but it wasn't chaos. It was a quiet unfolding, the kind that happens when something has been waiting a long, long time to bloom. The day of the picnic dawned warm and golden. Calder stood on the porch, adjusting the collar of his shirt, while Eli fussed over a lopsided tie someone had insisted he wear. Hazel and Willa twirled nearby in matching sundresses, their bare feet leaving damp footprints across the soft grass. Their hair shimmered in the sunlight, braided with tiny bluebells that Eli had helped them gather that morning. And Everly stood by the truck, loading up a basket so full it looked ready to burst. Fried chicken, homemade biscuits, fresh jam, and a small chocolate cake with family, scrawled in shaky white icing across the top. She caught Calder's eye and smiled, soft and private, and in that instant, he knew it down to his bones. This wasn't just a picnic. This was a beginning. They made their way out to the silo tree, the children racing ahead, whooping and laughing, the rope bucket clanging a welcome overhead. Beneath the great oak's newly budding branches, someone, probably Eli, had set up a simple blanket and a few mismatched chairs dragged from the shed. It wasn't polished. It wasn't fancy. It was perfect. After they ate, after the cake was reduced to a pile of sticky fingers and contented sighs, Calder stood and looked around at the faces he loved, really loved, with a fullness that left no empty corners inside him. He cleared his throat awkwardly, drawing their attention. "I've been thinking," he began, scratching the back of his neck, "about gates." The children tilted their heads, puzzled. "Gates keep things out," Calder said. "Or they keep things in. They're supposed to protect. But sometimes—" He paused, glancing at Everly, who smiled encouragingly. "Sometimes, a gate keeps you from seeing what's waiting for you. On the other side." Hazel clutched Willa's hand tightly. Eli sat cross-legged, looking up at his father with wide, trusting eyes. Calder knelt down, picking up a small stick, and began drawing in the dirt. 2 posts, a line connecting them, simple and clear. "That old gate back by the hospital," he said quietly. "The one where I found Hazel and Willa." He looked up, voice thickening. "If I hadn't stopped that night, if I hadn't opened my eyes, I would have missed all of this." He gestured to the tree, the blanket, the children, the woman sitting cross-legged with cake crumbs on her skirt and laughter in her eyes. "Sometimes," Calder said, "you have to open the gate yourself." There was a long, beautiful silence. Then Hazel stood up and marched over to the crude drawing in the dirt. With a solemnity that made Calder's chest ache, she dragged her heel across the line connecting the 2 posts, breaking it wide open. "There," she said firmly. "Now it's open." Willa giggled and clapped. Eli whooped and tossed a handful of grass into the air. Everly laughed and wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. And Calder felt something inside him break loose and soar. That evening, after the sun dipped low behind the hills and the air turned cool again, Calder and Everly sat together on the porch, arms brushing lightly, watching the children chase fireflies across the yard. "You ever think," Everly murmured, "that all we needed was one small opening?" Calder chuckled softly. "I think we needed someone stubborn enough to kick the gate down." Everly laughed, a sound like water over stones, like wind through spring leaves. "And patient enough to build it back up again," she said. Calder nodded, pulling her closer. "Together," he said simply. The stars blinked to life overhead, steady and ancient. The old record player spun quietly inside, Moon River humming into the night. The porch swing creaked. The silo tree whispered. And for the first time in too many years, Calder Briggs wasn't just surviving. He was home, far across the valley, back near the hospital where it all began. The old iron gate stood open now, permanently unlatched, gently swinging with the breeze. No more keeping out, no more keeping in, only welcoming whatever miracles might wander through next. If this story touched your heart even just a little, we'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. It's always a joy to see how kindness brings us all closer, no matter the distance. And if you believe the world could use a few more stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us keep sharing these moments of hope, healing, and the quiet magic of everyday goodness. Thank you, truly, for spending a little of your time with us today. Until we meet again, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep your heart open for the miracles just waiting to find you.